Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. Most of the time I focus on the LXD command line, and this time it's going to be a little bit different because I'm going to revisit LXDWare LXD Dashboard, which I discussed in an installation video some months back. But I'm also going to contrast LXD Dashboard with the QNAP Container Station and its functionality, and also the upcoming functionality of Container Station version 3.0. So I think this video will be valuable for both QNAP users and general LXD users. LXD web-based management is possible in QNAP Container Station and also in LXDWare LXD Dashboard. And in fact, in the past, I had an installation video on LXDWare LXD Dashboard. So LXD Dashboard is not the only GUI-based program for managing LXD containers. In fact, other programs that come to mind are LXD UI and also Mosaic. It's just that I think that LXDWare LXD Dashboard is probably the best product out there currently. So in this tutorial, we're going to learn how to use LXD dashboard functions for any LXD host, and we're going to also learn what QNAP is doing with LXD containers and Container Station. And we will focus on how LXDWare LXD Dashboard can be leveraged as a powerful container management tool and what makes LXD different on a QNAP NAS. So let's compare the differences in functionality between the two tools and see how to best perform graphical management of LXD containers. So first of all, here's what the graphical interface looks like on LXDWare LXD Dashboard. And if you haven't seen LXD Dashboard before, I created a video on it right about a year ago, last March, entitled LXDWare LXD Dashboard, and it goes over the installation and configuration of the product. But this time we want to talk about some of its capabilities. Here's the main screen of my LXDWare LXD Dashboard, and as you can see at the top level it lists LXD hosts. So the first two LXD hosts, named VMS Fog and VMS Cloud, are my QNAP NAS systems, which can also be managed by QNAP Container Station, but I prefer to use LXDWare LXD Dashboard instead, as you will see. The next two systems, VMS Mist and VMS Rain, are Minisforum UM350 systems, which I've also covered on the channel before in my presentation entitled Cheap Self-Hosting Server, and both of those are loaded with Ubuntu 22.04 with LXD configured on them. And then finally, this last system here, named Mondo, is my desktop machine, which is an Ubuntu 22.04 machine, which I have also configured LXD on. So just as a small review, in order to be able to add a LXD host to your LXD dashboard, you have to click on View Certificate. Once you do that, you can make a copy of that certificate and store it in a file on the system that you want to add to your LXDWare LXD dashboard. After you do that, what you do is you sign on to that host and you do a LXD config trust add and then the name of the certificate. And once you do that and that certificate is added, at that point in time you can click on add a host. You can type in the address of the host and give the host an alias, and once you do that it will be added to the list, and that's why I have 5 different LXD hosts being managed here. Now my actual LXD dashboard is in itself running inside of a LXD container, but it'll run on anything like a virtual machine, a LXD container, or even a bare metal piece of hardware. So first of all, let's look at what the difference might be between managing a LXD host that is running on a standard Linux machine, in my case, Ubuntu server, versus looking at a LXD implementation on a QNAP NAS. So first of all, we'll go ahead and look at my desktop machine, Mondo. As I click on it, you go in and you notice here at the very top, we see that I have one container running and I have two virtual machines, and the two virtual machines are both stopped currently, so it says 0/2. If we look at the containers, you can see that I have a Casa OS container currently running. And if we go back to the virtual machines, you can see that I have an Ubuntu VM and also a Windows 11 VM. And LXD also supports something called LXD Virtual Machines, and I have two videos that discuss how to create a LXD virtual machine for Windows 11, and I have one video that talks about how to create a LXD VM for Ubuntu. So back at the host level for my desktop machine Mondo, besides seeing how many containers are running and how many virtual machines are running, we can see how many images there are, how many profiles, how many networks, how many storage pools, projects, and also network ACLs. We're going to go over those in a minute, but let's scroll down here and let's look at LXD information. So on this particular machine, since it's a full-blown Linux machine, you can see that I have a driver. It says is LXC because the underlying supporting infrastructure for LXD is LXC. In fact, really, LXD I look at as being an API and a CLI for LXC containers, but hence they're called LXD containers. You can see here the driver version is 4.0.12, and then it also has a driver version for QEMU, and that's to support the virtual machines, and it is 6.1.1, and it says my storage type is ZFS, and what my storage version relates back to Ubuntu. So let's head over to the host called VMS Cloud, which is a QNAP NAS. Specifically, it's a QNAP TS1277. You can see that I have one container up and running presently, and I have 0 virtual machines. And in fact, QNAP NAS does not support LXD virtual machines. And we can see that if we move down here and we look at the information. You can see that the driver says LXC and its driver version 4.06, but there's no information regarding the QEMU driver or QEMU driver version because it does not support those. Also, my QNAP NAS is running QTS, and the QTS operating system, when you go create LXD inside of it with installing Container Station, the storage type is not ZFS. Instead, the storage type is directory. A storage type of directory in a QNAP container means that the files are simply stored in the directory structure. This is sort of unfortunate because the ZFS system is a little bit higher performance. On most Linux machines, you would be able to create a virtual ZFS file system inside of a file, and I've covered that on the channel before as well. Unfortunately, QNAP NAS does not support ZFS at all, so we can't even create a ZFS virtual device for our storage pool in LXD, and that's one key difference of QNAP NAS running LXD. So I really will go back and do a deep dive on how to use LXD Dashboard and what all those components are. But since we just discussed the differences between a system running LXD that is a Linux system and a system running LXD that's a QNAP NAS, let's head on over to the QNAP NAS. And here we are on my QNAP NAS, the 1277, which is VMS Cloud. So here we're looking at Container Station. And probably one of the first things we discover is that Container Station is capable of managing both Docker containers as well as LXD containers. And I might point out that it would also directly support LXC containers, but as of Container Station version 3.0, which should be released in the next month or so, I would assume, LXC containers will no longer be allowed to be managed or created from the GUI. And so you should have by now converted all of your containers to LXD containers. And in fact, I have another video that talks about how to convert LXC containers on your system, on your QNAP NAS, to LXD containers. On a Linux system that is not a QNAP NAS, you have a separate GUI utility to manage Docker containers, and most people use Portainer, but that's another subject. So let's look at Container Station and see what some of the options are. First of all, on the left-hand side, you can see that you get an overview. Down here, you have an option to create. So the create option is a little tricky because you don't really see anything in here that says create a LXD container. So in order to do that, you really have to type in the operating system. So as an example, we'll type in Ubuntu and we'll hit enter. Then you have a second screen come up, and the majority of what you see returned here are options to create Docker containers. Also, if you click on local, this shows you any of the locally downloaded images. And if you remember that for a while, when we go back to the LXD Dashboard interface, I'll show you where the locally cached images can be seen over there. The other thing that we have that's significant over here is a Docker Hub, and the Docker Hub option, of course, allows you to create Docker containers coming directly from the Docker Hub. But for our purposes, since we're talking about LXD, you have to click on LXD Image Server here. Since we typed Ubuntu, it comes back and lists all of the variants for the LXD images that can be created for Ubuntu, and you can see that it's the various versions of the operating system here. All the AMD 64 variant, because in my case, my QNAP NAS is a Ryzen-based machine, which uses the AMD 64, and that would be applicable for both Intel and AMD processors. So in order to create a container, you can simply go down and click on install. When you click on install, so the last one here is Jammy, and that is Jammy Jellyfish, I guess. Jammy Jellyfish is the latest release of Ubuntu. So when I click on install, it's going to go out and create myself a container. I'll go ahead and name this container test. And then you can specify how many CPUs you want. And this is really in the latest iteration that I just installed, because previously the CPU limit was expressed in terms of percentage of CPU. And we're going to go over that shortly. So let's say I wanted this to have 2 CPUs. The 16 number is because this Ryzen processor has 8 cores and 2 threads per core, which gives me 16 virtual CPUs, and that's why the max number is 16. So it's not like this takes off the top of the machine. It's just a relative amount that you'd be using. Same thing with memory. My max memory is 64,272 because I have 64 gigs of memory on this QNAP NAS, and I can just say 2048 megabytes, which would be 2 gigs of memory. I can go under advanced settings, and under here they have an option for MAC address. If you change this, it will go from gray to bolded, and you can hit that again and get a different MAC address. What this is doing is creating a virtual MAC address, and you're going to want to click on that, because if you don't, every time you bring up the new container, it will have a different MAC address, so we'll get a different IP address on the network. And remember that LXD containers you cannot configure with a static address, or at least not easily. And my recommended way to do that anyway is to get an address assigned to go off to your router and set a DHCP address reservation in order to set a static address. So by default, just like in LXD from the command line or LXDWare LXD Dashboard, it creates the container in NAT mode, which means it gets an address on the internal LXD network. And here you can also change to bridge mode. So bridge mode lets me go through any of my adapters. So I have adapter 1 plus 2, which are teamed together. I have adapter 3, which is actually a switch port tied to my IoT network, and adapter 4, which is a switch port that's tied to my Cloud DMZ network. So conspicuously missing from here are VLANs, and we're going to go over that in just a second. So we'll go ahead and create this container, and we'll make it a bridge container to the main LAN, and we'll just go ahead and tell it to create. And it says that there's a privilege mode required, and the reason for that is because if you have in File Station advanced folder permissions turned on, you have to enable the container as a privileged container, or else it will fail when it creates. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes, and then I can go back up here to the overview. You can see up here that it's in the process of creating the container. So while it's doing that, let's go over here to, not the gear, let's go over here to the 3 dots and do an about. So the percentage CPU that you saw, that wasn't there, and instead it indicated the number of virtual CPUs to use for the container. That began in Container Station version 2.6.4, which was a recent update as of about, I'm going to say around February the 6th or 7th perhaps. So now my container's been created. I have this test container here. When you click on this test container, you're going to be prompted in the terminal window for a login. All except you don't have a login yet, because there's no way to log into it without a username and a password. And although they have a username of Ubuntu and a password of Ubuntu by default on the container, if I type Ubuntu in Ubuntu, I'm not sure it'll sign me in. And sure enough, it doesn't sign me in. So how do you log into one of these new containers? Well, you have to go over to the terminal option. And then in the terminal option, you want to, as it says in gray, type /bin/bash, which will give you a bash shell. This will open up another tab in your web browser. When it opens up that tab, you will end up with a prompt up here. And the first thing you want to do is do an add user for a username. So here I'm adding Scott, and I'm giving Scott a password. And then after it creates the Scott account, since I really want to have privilege on the Scott account, I'm going to do a user mod -a g capital G sudo Scott, which places Scott in the sudo group. And I know this is really small print. I just didn't want to change the size of my interface here, but the login that you get from that terminal is a root login, and that's why we didn't have to use the sudo command. I'll go ahead and exit, and I will close this tab in the web browser. When I come back over here, I can type the username of Scott along with the password I just created, and I'm able to log in, and that's how you grant yourself access in a new LXD Container in Container Station. So the thing that is lacking in current Container Station is the ability to create a container, a LXD container, directly on a VLAN. And you can do that, or I've done that in this particular case, by taking one of the network adapters on my QNAP NAS, setting the switch port to be for that particular VLAN, and that way it's on the VLAN. So that's not the way that you should be doing it. And unfortunately, we don't really have support for it yet. But if you go into the network and virtual switch application, you can go down to the option for interfaces. When you go into the interfaces option, you can look at one of your adapters, and if you move over to the ... it has an option to add a VLAN. And so if I add a VLAN for a currently connected device, it will go ahead and disconnect. But what it will do is it will allow you to create multiple VLANs on that device. Now, that should work just fine, because you should be able to turn around, and when you create a new device over here like test, and we looked at that drop down for the interfaces, for example, we go off here and we do another create, we type in Ubuntu, we go over here to image server, we go ahead and install a jammy, and we say test 2, which we're not actually going to create this time. And we go down to advanced settings. In advanced settings, if we go down to NAT, we should be able to have NAT, and we should be able to have bridge, and then it should list the other VLANs. However, unfortunately, today it does not do that. And that's one of the improvements that we're going to see in Container Station 3.0. So here's the QNAP NAS Container Station 3.0. This is sort of an advertisement that they have over on the QNAP website describing some of the new capabilities we can expect to see in Container Station 3.0. And I do promise I'm going to get back to talking about LXD Dashboard. But this first screen that they're presenting over in the QNAP site for Container Station 3.0 shows Docker containers. So keep in mind that Container Station manages both Docker containers and LXD containers, whereas LXD Dashboard only manages LXD containers, and you would have to use something like Portainer to manage Docker containers. So here they're saying before, in the current version 2.x that I was just showing, you first need to delete your Docker container and then create a new Docker container to change configuration. And here in 3.0, they're allowing you to change your configuration and update in real time by using the new recreate option to recreate a container. So that's kind of nice. We were hoping that they would provide something along that line. Okay, so the second thing they have here is they say that there are convenient settings. And they say to save the frequently used container commands for efficiency, they said that before in version 2.x, you could only repeatedly enter frequently used commands when making container changes. In Containers 3.0, you can add frequently used commands. And I can't imagine what that would be particularly. It looks like they're allowing you to save commands and I guess assign hotkeys to them that you can use in the terminal. But in any event, that's what they consider to be a new feature for that. Moving right along, they say that there's easier management because you can upload image and YAML files from the cloud or from local devices. So this should make things a lot easier in order to create your containers. It used to be that if you wanted to create a containerized application that was a Docker container, you used to basically have to cut and paste the YAML into the interface. Now they're allowing you to update or upload the YAML either from your local computer or from someplace on File Station. So then they also say that they're going to allow multiple network modes. They said either NAT or bridge mode is supported for containers to communicate with each other. And that was what we had before. You notice that when I created the new container, my two choices were NAT or bridge. They're saying in Container Station 3.0, they're going to support multiple network modes and VLANs for flexible deployment. So I see this, they're going to support this in one of two ways. Either what they're going to do is they're going to allow you to create a VLAN profile like we do from the LXD command line, or how we can do from the interface in LXD Dashboard, or what they're going to do is allow you to create a VLAN adapter in your network option that I had demonstrated just a while ago, and then use it in here. So it's not entirely sure which way they're going to go, but I can see either way being a good feature. Personally, I would prefer that they use VLAN profiles, because profiles in LXD are extremely powerful. And then the next thing they're talking about here is customized container information lists. And they say that in Container Station 3.0, you can use up to 23 information items on the container information list for a flexible display. So I suppose what that means is that the things that you see listed in Container Station, CPU usage, and so on, you can customize what you're going to see in those columns, which is a very nice addition. And then you can choose app templates for quick starts, and that makes sense. They've always been able to do that before, but they're also saying that frequently used apps or containers can be saved as templates. So on the channel before, one of the things I pointed out is that you can create a LXD container and you can add things to it like your user account, or perhaps Docker or some other program. Let's say you add net tools or something else that you use. And then after you get the configuration the way that you want it, you can actually export that as an image. An image can be used as a template to build other LXD containers. And I suppose that's what they're saying. They're providing support for images. So that's pretty much what they've got here. I guess if you scroll down the page, they're going to talk about K3S. And of course, K3S are the lightweight Kubernetes clusters. They provided support for those back in 2.x. And they're basically saying that they think the whole user interface with Container Station is going to be a lot easier in 3.0. I still have one fairly fundamental problem with Container Station, and even Container Station in 3.0, is that you still notice that Container Station in 3.0 is supposed to support Docker containers in LXD containers. And nowhere did they describe or provide support for LXD virtual machines. And I suppose the reason they did that is because they figure that a QNAP NAS supports Virtualization Station, which is a separate application that can create QEMU VMs. But why they didn't tie it all together and have one interface, Container Station, manage virtual machines, being LXD VMs, LXD containers, and Docker, I'll never know. In fact, I provided quite a bit of input over the past year and a half to QNAP, indicating they should do as such. But so far, there's no integration between the QEMU virtual machines that you see in Virtualization Station and LXD. Therefore, Container Station will not manage LXD VMs, nor can you create them. And as a reminder, when we go back to LXDWare LXD Dashboard and look at VMS Cloud from that side, you can see that there is no integration here for QEMU. In fact, the only driver is the LXC driver, and so therefore we can never create LXD virtual machines. And I have tried to add the integration I have called QNAP multiple times, and it seems this request is pretty much lost on them. On the QNAP NAS VMS cloud, if we go down and look at containers, we can see that I've had a Tautuli container, which is a LXD container, running out there. But I also have this test container that I created just a short while ago in Container Station. And so it has an address on the main LAN, and the reason it does is because I chose the bridged option when I created it. If I click on test, you can see it goes in here and it tells me what the addresses are, both the IPv4 addresses, and since I have configured IPv6 on my main LAN, you can also see the IPv6 address. You can see that the image it used was Ubuntu Jammy. You can see the container is currently running. If I go over to config, you can see that it was allocated 2 CPUs as opposed to a percentage CPU allowance, which is this guy. And that's because they decided to change the interface from a percentage of CPU usage to a number of virtual cores. So I had 16 virtual cores, and I said use 2 of the virtual cores. And again, this is kind of a suggestion. It isn't that 2 of the cores disappear and are permanently allocated towards this test container. It just means that it can use up to 2 virtual cores of performance when it is executing the program that happens to be installed inside of this container. So if we go back to overview, I just want you to see we can stop the container from LXDWare LXD Dashboard. It put in red up here, it was stopping the container. It's now stopped. You can tell it stopped because we have a play button there to start it back up again. And then down here, if we look at the addresses, we don't see any addresses because the container's currently stopped. We have an option in the pull down next to the play button, and we can go off and delete this container. So remember, and I didn't delete this container, remember that there's also an option over here to, when we went in and we created this test container, we created a username of Scott, and we gave Scott sudo privilege. So if I wanted that to be a starting point, I could always go over here and say, publish this. And if I say publish this, I can say Jammy with Scott account. And then I can say the OS was Ubuntu, and I can just remind myself that it was 22.04. So I'm just documenting this. Public is going to be false. To make that true just means I want to push it back up to the LXD Container Hub. So I'll do a submit. So now it says downloading image. And what it's doing is it's downloading a copy of that image from this currently running image called test. And this is going to be similar to the 3.0 option where you can go ahead and create custom images that I showed you in Container Station 3.0. But you have this today in LXDWare LXD Dashboard. So it's going to take a little while to create this image, sometimes a couple of minutes, depending upon the complexity of your container. So now that my image has been created, because I don't see this red up here anymore, I can go down to where it says images on the left-hand margin. When I click on images, it will list any of the images that were downloaded from the LXD repository on the web, but it also lists this container I just created, or this image I just created called Jammy with Scott account. So now what I can do is I can go back to containers. I can say, create me a new container and call this container test2, and then give it a description, test from an image. So QNAP didn't give you the option to put in the description field, but you can put in the description field here. If you have images set as none here, and you hit the drop down and you don't see anything listed, it means that you have to go get an image from the hub before you'll be able to create a container. We'll go over that here in just a second. But the image drop down says none here, and I scroll down and I pick Jammy with Scott account. And then profile default. So over here, as I've covered on the channel many times before, I've created multiple profiles like bridge profile and so on. And even though I'm creating this on the QNAP, there's no such thing as using the QNAP's bridge profile. So I have created my own bridge profile called bridge profile. But that being said, you always need to create this thing with the default profile first. And the reason you need to do that is because we need to add profiles to it later. It must always have the bridge profile, since the bridge profile defines the root disk file system for the LXD container. Then the thing you'll always want to do here is go down and set auto start equals to true, because that means that when the LXD host, in this case the QNAP NAS, boots, it will start Container Station and start this container. If you're on a regular Linux node, when it boots up that Linux node and starts LXD, it will start this container. You can go over here to limits, and again, we could say CPU, and we could say 2 CPUs instead of using the allowance, or we can go down here and give it an allowance. And we can make a number of other changes as well, since we know that QNAP NAS is going to require this to use the privileged key. We're going to go ahead and go to security and say privileged is equal to true, or else the container won't stop. And then I can do an OK, and it will go off and create the test2 container, and it will start it when it's done. You can see up here it says creating instance test2. So we have test1 currently stopped up here, and we have test2 that we're just now creating, and when it's done creating, it should start. And I guess it didn't start, so let's go ahead and start it. And it says starting test2. It comes up and it is running. So I click over here. It says it was created with the image Jammy with the Scott account, and it's giving me an internal IP address, a NAT IP address. As a reminder, if we go back to our container listing on VMS Cloud, we now have the Tatuli container, which we had before we started all this. We have the test2 container, which is up and running, and we have the test container. And for some reason, the test2 container has not taken on an IP address, and I realize why that is. The reason that is, and you'll run into this too if you have a QNAP NAS, if I created it with the bridge device up there, when I try to add profiles to it, like the bridge profile, it will not work. And the reason it will not work is because I need to go back and change it to the NAT profile before it will work. And so I'll show you that. Here we'll go over to the overview in Container Station. We'll go down to test2, and we will go to settings, and we'll go down to advanced settings, and then we'll go to network mode and we'll change it to NAT, and then we'll do an apply. And then likewise, we'll go back over to overview, we'll go down to the test container, we'll go to settings, and we'll go to advanced settings, and we'll change it from bridge to NAT, and we'll do an apply. So from the QNAP perspective, you would think that that put those containers on the internal NAT network, and that is true. But when we go back to LXD Dashboard, and since we have the default profile here and the bridge profile, and now it is technically NAT in the background, when we look at the container and we restart this test2 container, when it comes back up, this time it'll get an address on the LAN, and you can see here that it's giving you an error. Occasionally you'll end up with that kind of error, and sometimes when you do the back and forth between the QNAP and the LXD container, You will run into this sort of problem. It can be really removed by going over here to containers. We'll go to test 2. We'll go to profiles. And under profiles, we'll go ahead and delete the bridge profile. And then we'll go back to containers. We'll go back to test. We'll go to profiles. And we don't yet have the bridge profile over here. So we'll go ahead and add the bridge profile to test. By adding in bridge profile, I submit that. Then we come back over here to containers and go to test 2 and go to profiles, add a profile and add the bridge profile to him as well and submit that. Now if we go back to containers overview and we get our newer one, test 2, and we go ahead and start it, this time it should start and not give us any errors, but it does give us an error, and sometimes it just pays to go create your containers over here, because once you've created bridge profile on that side, life is not good. So we'll go back to test and we'll try to start the test container, and I suspect we'll run into the same error because we've edited it from both sides, but sometimes we may be surprised, and we are surprised in this case. So it says showing the console of test, and now we have under here our profiles, and we have default profile and bridge profile. If we go back over here to overview, we should be seeing an IP address popping up, hopefully. And if not, again, sometimes it just pays to go delete the container and recreate it. But there you go. We just got the address. So the profile worked in this particular case on test, but when we copied our configuration for test 2, it didn't particularly like that over there. And that's probably because Container Station 2.x can't really deal with that, although it's a valid thing to do under LXD. It is not valid to do on the QNAP side. So I'll go ahead and delete this container. I can just hit the wastebasket, delete it. And you notice over test here, we don't have an option to delete it. That's because it's running. So we'll go ahead and stop it. It says that it's in the process of stopping, hopefully. Go back into this container. Hit stop again. And there we go, it stopped. So I can go up here and say delete this container. And yes, I want to delete it. And when I go back to the container overview, I just have the Tatuli container, and both test and test 2 have been deleted on the QNAP NAS. If we go back over here to VMS Cloud, you can see we have Tatuli, the Docker containers, which are not managed in LXD, and we don't have test or test 2 because they have been deleted. So let's look at some of the other options in LXDWare LXD Dashboard. And by doing that, we're going to go ahead and go over to the Mondo machine, which is my desktop machine. And you can see here I have one container running, which is one LXD container. And I have two LXD virtual machines, not to be confused with regular virtual machines, because these are LXD virtual machines. Again, I have two videos on the channel for LXD VMs for Windows 11, and I have one on the channel for LXD VM for Ubuntu. And I actually have one more video that is entitled, I believe, What are LXD VMs Anyway? So between all of those, it does explain the LXD VMs. So we went over hosts. That gives you the list of LXD hosts you can manage, and we showed how to add those hosts. We went over containers, which gives you the list of running containers. And we went over virtual machines, which gives you the list of running LXD VMs. We went over images and showed how to create an image, where we created an image, and over here I actually had one called Ubuntu 2004 with Scott account on this particular machine. And then we went over profiles, in that you can create profiles from the command prompt, but you can also create a profile over here if you give this thing a name, but you have to know how to go in and enter the JSON data. The best way to do that sometimes is, let's say I wanted to create one for VLAN. I might go in and look at one of my other profiles. For example, I could say edit my VLAN 30 profile. I could make a copy of all of that, and I could cancel out of here, and I can say create me a new profile, and then I can go ahead and paste this in here, and then I can give it a description of something like VLAN 100, and then assuming it will still use my parent bridge 0 device, and it's going to use MAC VLAN protocol, and maybe the VLAN number will be something different like VLAN 100 here, and then I would name it VLAN 100. That's how we modify the JSON and make that happen. Of course, on the channel, I always talk about how you can do these things by hand, but we just created a new one there, and it's VLAN 100 for IoT VLAN, it says, which isn't right. VLAN 100, let's just say VLAN 100 VLAN, because it's not any particular use VLAN I have out there. So we modified it where it just says VLAN 100 VLAN. And then you can likewise look at bridge profile, which you should already have if you've been watching the channel. But if you go in and look at it, it basically says we're going to use the parent bridge 0. It's going to be type bridged, and that's it. But you only need one bridge profile. It'll also go down and tell you which containers are currently using the bridge profile. So that's what profiles are. Networks are basically all the networks that have been created on your LXD host computer. So in this particular case on Mondo, when we did a LXD init, it creates the LXD BR0 network, which is a way for the local NAT containers to reach out to the network if they're created on the NAT. The loopback connector is the loopback connector. ENP4S0 is my physical adapter on this particular desktop machine. WLP3S0 is the wireless adapter on this machine. And bridge 0, if you've watched my channel before, is the one that bridges back to my physical adapter, which is ENP4S0, in order to create containers on the main LAN. And then Docker 0 is a Docker bridge that gets created when you install Docker. And then VIR BR0, I believe, was created as a result of VirtualBox, because VirtualBox needs its own bridge as well. So you can see all of these particular devices. You can also add other network devices up here, as well as being able to add devices inside of a container. So the next thing we have down here are storage pools. And by default, you only have one storage pool. If you have a QNAP NAS, if you have created LXD and done a LXD init, the name of the storage pool it creates by default is named default. And then by default, it uses the ZFS driver, and by default, it creates that inside of a virtual file. In this particular case, it's saying it's stored over on /var/snap/lexd/common/lexd/dis/default.image. The reason for that is because LXD on Mondo was installed with a snap, which is the default in Ubuntu, and that's why it is storing the LXD image file down there. I've got some videos which talk about how to enlarge the ZFS pool, because right now this one's 30 gigabytes. I have a video that talks about how to enlarge it and make it bigger, because once you have your total number of containers exceed that 30 gigabytes, you're going to need to expand that space. So you can also create new storage pools. So you can create storage pools of all these different types. Dir simply means that it is a directory storage pool, which means that it just stores files in the native file system. That's what QNAP uses by default, and they don't give you the ability to create any other types of pools. ZFS would be my favorite. My second favorite might be BTRFS, and you can read the documentation about the other types of storage pools that you may create. And storage pools can either use virtual files, or they can also use dedicated disks where they format the disk and use the entire disk as a storage pool. And that is a built-in capability of LXD that is simply exposed in LXDWare LXD Manager here, or LXD Dashboard, I should say. So other features that LXDWare LXD Dashboard has are below the line over here on the left-hand side. One of them is cluster members, and that's out of scope for this presentation, but just know that it's possible to cluster LXD systems, so you can have more than one LXD node, and you can fail LXD container instances over from one cluster member to another cluster member. The next thing we have here is projects. By default, when you do a LXD init, you get the default project. You can create other projects. This is if you're doing your LXD at a company and you want to have particular LXD containers grouped under projects. You can create user accounts with LXD Dashboard, and you can also create projects, and you can have projects assigned to users, and so that way you can keep things divided. In line with that, you also have network ACLs, which control who's allowed to use which interfaces and so on. Then we have the Operations tab. The Operations tab tells us whether you have something that is taking place, like perhaps a export of a container or a snapshot of a container, or a container starting up or shutting down. And finally, we have certificates. We went over that in the beginning. When you create yourself a new LXD container or a new LXD host, when you create a new LXD host, you have to take the certificate and load it on that particular device before LXDWare LXD Dashboard will allow you to add it to the management list here and be able to manage that node. So one more thing that's really interesting to cover is if you have a brand new LXD configuration, let's assume that Mondo was brand new, and we go into containers, and let's suppose that there are no containers here. If we click on add a container and we give this thing a name like test, and we give this thing some kind of description, and we go down to image, if we hit this drop down, you won't have any images in here. None will be your only choice. And you won't be able to create a container that will actually start because it's got to be based on some kind of an image. So that being said, you can go over to the Images tab, you can click on the plus image, and you can go ahead and add one of these images to the system as a starting point. And once you do that, then, for example, let's say I wanted to put the Ubuntu 2210 image on here, which I don't currently have. And I'll say, download me the container image, not the virtual machine image for it. And it will say, downloading image metadata, creating the root FS. And then I have down here now the Ubuntu 2210 release, which is going to be the Ubuntu Kinetic release right here. So then if I go back to containers and say create me a container and call this thing test and give it a description, this is a test, I can now go down and pick the Ubuntu Kinetic container, Ubuntu 2210, and I can say make this thing auto start and then go down and say OK, and it will create this new Ubuntu 2210 container from the image that I have just downloaded. And now once it's created that, I'll go ahead and start it. It says it's starting. And it's started, and we have an Ubuntu 2210 container. Again, because I didn't specify or couldn't specify when I originally created it, it creates it on the NAT address. So I go over here to profiles, I go ahead plus profile, I come up here and say I want to add it to the bridge profile, and I submit it. Then what it does is it adds it to the bridge profile. When I come back here to overview, it will clear out this IP address, and it will be putting in an IP address for my main LAN here shortly. There, it cleared it out, and that address that comes back up will be a 172.16.1 address, and you'll see it shortly if this is going to be quick. If not, we'll see it more slowly. Hey, in computers, you spend most of your time thinking. There we go. 172.16.1.164, and that's in virtue of the fact that I've done this. So we've already looked at overview. We've looked at config. We've looked over here at console. We know what console is. And exec, we've also kind of looked at in the past on other videos. And what the exec is, again, we're going to have to hit this one time. Go over here, acknowledge it. We can exit the JSON, dismiss the screen. Then we can say start exec, and it gives me that root logon to the account. Once I have the root logon, I'm able to create myself a user account so that I can consequently go into console here and log into it. Because if I hit start console here, it's going to give me a login, and if I don't have a user account that I created in exec, I won't be able to log in. Then we have logs, which shows you the logs from starting the container, what all it did. And we have the LXC logs, which kind of talk about what's going on inside the container. And you'll always end up with some errors, but it could be valuable when you're trying to debug something. Devices is simply shows you your network devices, disk devices, and so on. So you have quite a bit of flexibility here through the GUI. Oh yeah, so snapshots give you the ability to snapshot a container. I always like to say initial install. So let's say I installed a whole bunch of stuff in this container, but I'm getting ready to do something I think is dangerous. I go ahead and come in and submit a backup, and it does a snapshot almost instantly. And so if I make any changes to this container, I can go back up here and say restore snapshot. And I know these things are grayed out, and it did that restore just that quickly. Of course, it didn't have anything to do because I hadn't made any changes. I know these look like they're grayed out, but they're really not. That's a fault I see with their interface. So the first one is restore snapshot. The second one is create instance from the snapshot. So not only can we create images from containers, but we can create images from snapshots. And that's what the second one does here. And so you can actually create an image from a snapshot and then create another container from that image, which was initially a snapshot. I know that's complicated, but yes, you can do that. And then publish image was the thing that I mentioned earlier. You can go off and publish the image as well, and then you can go off and delete the snapshot. So we have really quite a bit of capability here. These are all things that can all be done via the LXD command line, which is LXC. I know it's confusing, but here you can see we can do them all in the LXDWare LXD Dashboard GUI. And for that reason, I really like this interface for both regular Linux nodes and also for the QNAP NAS in lieu of using Container Station. So in summary, QNAP Container Station 3.0 cleans up the interface a bit and adds a few valuable functions to LXD management in a GUI. I will review Container Station 3.0 when it's released to production, but it's currently still in closed beta, and I usually like to review things that are already out in production. So my thoughts are that everyone should learn the LXD CLI because it provides more functionality than really any GUI. So that being said, I believe that LXDWare LXD Dashboard is a better GUI interface experience than Container Station currently. And for that matter, I also think it exceeds LXD UI as well as LXD Mosaic. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.